Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us again in another OWASP meetup. I'm here with Abdullah, and we have Stefan Edwards for our guest speaker. It's a pleasure to have him on here. He has a huge depth and breadth of security across the industry itself. So, without further ado, Stefan, can you take it away?
Perfect. I don't know if I have depth. I certainly have breadth across a lot of different things. Also, before I dive into the whole thing, I did want to say that there's a few of us running a con in December around the 16th and 17th. So if you follow Absolute AppSec and you've seen like a Midwinter's Night Con, that's the next conference that I'll be speaking at, and quite a few other folks will be there too. So I'm sorry to steal the thunder from this talk, but I did want to just plug that one as well. Am I actually displaying though, Ben? It looks like it is just us. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you very much. So welcome everyone. My name is Stefan Edwards. I am going to talk about the good, the bad, and the blockchain. It's a love story in 17 parts. I'll get into my background, but effectively I am a blockchain nihilist, and we'll be talking through some of the good things that we see in blockchain, some of the bad things, and some of the truly ugly things that I don't think people always understand when they're getting into blockchain, when they're getting into security of blockchain, blockchain adjacent things, etc. So I have quite a few points in here. I don't know if I'll make it through all of them given the time, but you always can look at the slides after this. It's in Markdown. I'll post them right after this talk. But basically, I'll go through an intro to myself, the company I work at, that sort of thing. I'll give you some takeaways, go over some definitions, because some of the terms that I'll be using are a little bit different than maybe what you've seen before or the types of security that you do. And none of these are specific to blockchain per se, but it's some of the techniques that we are able to bring to bear in blockchain. And I'll get into what I mean by that as well. Then I'll go through the good things, which will be like formal methods and some other neat stuff that we see. I'll go through some of the bad, which will be the languages and some of the environmental things and some of the cost factors that people don't necessarily think about. And I'll go down into the truly ugly things, which are like time of check, time of use, off-chain components, and everything I dislike is actually traditional InfoSec. But if you take away three things from this talk, which I'll talk about a whole bunch of nonsense, and you'll probably be left in a stupor wondering why you listened to me rant for this long. But if you take away three things, I want you to take away these. It's that NIST has a interagency report 8202, which has the diagram that you see on the right-hand side of the screen there. Basically, it's a flow chart as to you almost certainly do not need a blockchain. There are very few actual applications that require you to have a blockchain. There are very few applications that actually need to have those sorts of things. There are maybe ancillary controls that you can use, such as auditing. And there are only a few cases in which you actually probably need a blockchain. And most of the time we see people trying to wedge things in, and it's a misapplication of the technology. However, having said that, blockchain actually does get many things correct. And some of those things are actually better than what we see in traditional InfoSec. So I do, despite the fact that this talk will go through some of the bad things and some of the ugly things that we see in blockchain, I do want to also celebrate the things that blockchain is doing well and how it's actually moving the industry as a whole forward. But I do want to cap it off with the fact that there are no golden roads to security. There are no golden roads to CAP theorem. There are no golden roads to correctness. Nothing that we're doing here, nothing that we'll be going through is a shortcut, a cheat. Blockchain is not magic. It is a bunch of mathematics and potentially nonsense that actually comes together to actually, build state. And we'll talk through what those things are. But nothing is a golden road. And so if you hear anyone trying to sell you on blockchain as a panacea for whatever problem you have, it's most likely nonsense. So who am I? My name is Stefan Edwards. I am a practice lead at Trail of Bits. I handle a lot of our threat modeling processes, some of our information security officer processes, a lot of our weirder assessments. I've also previously done some of the Kubernetes work that we've done, some of the Golang work, etc. So I have a very strange set of things that I actually work on here at Trail of Bits. Prior to coming to Trail of Bits, I worked at a company called Invisium, doing sort of like adversary simulation and some other things here with Dilla, who's one of the co-hosts of this show. Also, too, obviously, I do have a bit of an accent at times, and I am a little bit deaf, although I think no one will be asking live questions here. But if I ask you to repeat, it's not you, it's just me processing things and not being able to actually hear you. Now, I work for a firm named Trail of Bits, and we actually do quite a bit of blockchain and blockchain adjacent work. And the reason why I'm bringing this up here is not to plug us. There are plenty of people in companies and people in this space. It's not that. It's that many of the things that I'm talking about are real pain points that we see with actual customers. So if I'm talking about like Solidity issues, or I'm talking about people who are trying to make the transition to Vyper, it's because we see between 5 and 10 smart contract assessments per month. And then we also work on bespoke blockchains themselves. So we do a lot of the infrastructure around blockchains and a lot of the various off-chain accoutrements that go along with a lot of the projects that you'll see out here and some of the things that we'll discuss. And then also, lastly, we do bring a lot of our like researchy side of the house to the tools that we work on. So we have Manticore, we have Echidna for property testing, we have Slither, and a few other things that we do. And we work in cryptography, infrastructure, etc. So a lot of what I'll be ranting about is not just things that I've read in the news or things that I've read on Twitter, but these are things that we actually deal with day to day with our customers as we're trying to assess blockchains, smart contracts, those sorts of things. Now, I think I wanted to stop for a second and explain what I mean by blockchains, because I think the word has become a little bit overused. I think the word has become a little bit diluted. Most of the time when folks are talking about blockchains, they're usually talking about cryptocurrencies. They're talking about ETH, they're talking about Bitcoin, they're talking about some token that lives on one of those blockchains and those sorts of things. Every once in a while, you'll have someone who maybe means distributed state. When I'm talking about blockchains, I'm talking about consensus algorithms, I'm talking about virtual machines, I'm talking about the programs that run on those virtual machines or in the validator nodes, such as smart contracts, I'm talking about storage, etc. And this is obviously fairly complex. So a lot of the things that I'm going to go over tonight, and I will wander all over the landscape, up and down the stack in blockchains, but a lot of the things that I'll be going over tonight are just various things that maybe you hadn't considered previously, or maybe you hadn't seen as visible in the news and whatnot from your experience and from the general perception thereof. But a lot of the things that we see are actually at a very different level. We are not very often dealing with money per se, but most of our work focuses on the sort of guts that make up blockchains there. And indeed, attacks do actually occur at all levels of this stack. There was a recent attack in Geth where a small bug in how I believe they implemented EIP 211 actually caused a partial chain split. And they had to do some emergency releases in order to fix that and bring the chain back into consensus. I also linked to our report here on Pantheon just to talk about some of the things that we've seen at the network and wire level here. So very frequently when we're doing these sorts of assessments, blockchains very often have some sort of wire protocol or some sort of like serialization protocol that they've used to actually transfer state and whatnot. And we actually end up fuzzing those things and find all sorts of conditions that maybe they hadn't considered, or maybe were just new cases there. And it's a fairly interesting set of attacks and has nothing to do with smart contracts, virtual machines, any of the sorts of things that maybe people are more familiar with. And at the other end of the spectrum are just very simple bugs, right? You have contracts with 500 million, with $700 million, and they haven't necessarily been audited, or they were in the process of being audited, such as Yam Finance. And they lost this money, or it was locked up, due to a single line. They forgot to add a division operation there to make sure that they were actually dividing by the base that they expected to. And so their total supply was actually locked up in a handful of operations. So the attacks that we'll be talking through will span all of these areas. I've selected some that I thought were a little more interesting or were a little more nihilistic in my ranty vein, but basically all up and down the stack of blockchain itself. And I think there's two real things that we need to talk about before we get into this. Blockchain, what an actual blockchain is, some of the terms that surround blockchains themselves, and formal methods. At Trail of Bits, we do obviously do security, and several of the other folks who work in the blockchain community work in formal methods or work in more advanced types of methodology and techniques around how they approach program analysis. And it's not necessarily the most common technique, especially if you're in traditional InfoSec or you're working in, you're working as a programmer, you're working in tools every day. So I thought we'd define those sorts of things and then define, obviously, lots of things around blockchains themselves. So when I say blockchain, I basically mean some consensus algorithm with some storage system, with some validation system, and then often some sort of like virtual machine, wire protocol, et cetera, associated with it. But at its core, the thing that we're actually worried about is the consensus algorithm, how we store things, and how we validate things. So at the base of it all, blockchains are really just replicated state machines. There's some sort of mechanism that understands the current node's state, and then it attempts to broadcast that state to other systems out there. And it does so by a various different means. There's Byzantine fault tolerance. There's the sort of proof of work that we've all probably heard about that Ethereum uses and is attempting to move away from, that Bitcoin uses, and quite a few other blockchains. But then there are other mechanisms that folks use as well. So there's proof of stake, which is basically, I have this much stake, I have this much money that I'm willing to hedge on this calculation. And there's obviously a little bit more complexity to it. And then there's also proof of authority, which is like, dude, you totally understand, you know me, I'm totally good for this money. But basically, what we need to do is we need to say, this is how I view the world. This is where I think the world came from. And now I need to socialize that to all of my peers. So no matter which consensus algorithm we're using or which permission system we're using, we basically need some simple mechanism by which we actually relay this to all of our peers within the same cluster itself. So at its core, a blockchain is actually just something very simple. We'll build one right here. We need some function H. H can be fairly complex. It can be like an iterated SHA-256. It can be some iterated bcrypt. It can be some sort of very complicated system, or it can be fairly simple. It depends on the security properties. But for our purposes, we just need some H. Doesn't matter what this hash function is. And we need some key K. Wow. And then all we really need to do is take the hash, like basically an HMAC of that key and some data, and gain a unique value. Now, there's obviously some complexity. If you're familiar with blockchains, we do this until we get to certain constraints, like with proof of work. Maybe you have a padding of all zeros at the beginning of your unique value. But basically, you're doing some calculations, you're deriving it over data, and then you just repeat this over all of the new data that you receive. So we might have a genesis block, which we see up here. So we have H, we have K, our key, and then we have data 0. That's our genesis block. That's where we start from. And then the next block that we actually produce is just H of K of data 1 plus the result of data 0, and so on and so forth. So by the time we get down to our third block, we've actually applied H multiple different times, and we know the value of all of the previous nodes here, and they are included in the current block itself. Now, we're actually satisfying some of the properties here that we laid out, right? Our consensus algorithm is effectively proof of authority plus sole source. So this is similar to how things like linked timestamping or the certificate revocation list work. It's basically published by a known source. It's signed by some key that only they control. And you basically assume that they have authority over this. And that is our consensus algorithm. It's not fairly complex, but it is one that we can use here as well. And indeed, our storage system for this is just a simple linked list of nodes. We have a linked list that points to the current head, and then the entire trail of it includes the hash of the current value plus the previous values that we've seen in the list itself. And then lastly, our last item that we have to satisfy is validation. So it's fairly easy to check. In my system, maybe I'm just HMACing with a key that I know. Maybe I'm signing with something so that I don't have to broadcast my key and then anyone can tamper with it. But basically, we just validate that I produced that value itself and that I had ownership of the key as I produced that value. Now, why do we actually care about this, right? Well, it comes down to the fact that when we have this sort of validation mechanism, I have done the work, I have shown that I have ownership of the key. It actually comes when someone attempts to insert a new value into the chain. So let's say here we have an attacker who's trying to use their key, attacker K, and then we can actually see in our system, in this logi chain that we're working on, this is not the key that we expected. This is not an authority that we trusted when we were constructing our blockchain, and therefore it is not a valid block. And we actually go with this block over here on the left-hand side. So our blockchain, obviously fairly simple, but actually does satisfy the needs that we have of a very simple, basically validation system that we need here to produce blocks. So these concepts themselves are actually quite old. Most blockchains use what are called Merkle trees or hash trees in a Merkle style. They're from 1979 when I believe Ralph Merkle was working on these sorts of things. And some blockchains do use AVL trees, which are of a similar vintage that had been Merkleized as part of their data structures. We also have linked timestamping, which is from 1992. Linked timestamping is actually fairly close to what I just displayed in logi chain here. But basically, it's a series of applications of hash functions with a key that we can guarantee only came from a single source. And we know that that nothing has been tampered in the chain because we can actually calculate all of those values along the linked list itself. And then obviously, there's also direct acyclical graphs, which are from the late 1950s. But basically, all we have to do for a very simple blockchain is hash some stuff or sign some stuff and then socialize it via some mechanism. There's not really all that much complexity with these things. And anyone who claims that there's all sorts of magic going on here maybe doesn't necessarily, or maybe is trying to send you in a different direction than what you should be looking at, which is just, it's a bunch of math that is applied in order, and then we basically distribute it to our peers. So why do we actually do this, right? We are looking for multiple parties who are maybe mutually mistrustful to calculate some value. So in this system, we have like Alice who's saying the value is 3, Bob who's saying the value is 3, and Mallory is saying the value is 7. So now we have to come to some sort of consensus of what the actual value should be. And if you're familiar with blockchains, you probably could see that this is most likely vulnerable to a 33% attack here. So we maybe have some other consensus mechanism that requires 66%, such as the way that Tendermint works for certain operations. But basically, we're trying to have multiple parties, any one of which may be malicious, maybe incorrect, maybe out of date, out of sync, etc., to calculate values and then come up with what that value actually should be. Now, we obviously here have 2 nodes that are saying that the value is 3, so therefore our consensus algorithm is going to adopt that value, and we're going to ignore the chain split that Mallory is attempting there by saying the value is 7. So the concepts in blockchain themselves are fairly simple. Where this talk might get a little hairy is we actually are also going to introduce formal methods. Now, a lot of the things that we talk about in blockchain, in a lot of the tools that we work in, are actually fairly digestible, and you may have seen them in college, or you may have seen them in books on static analysis, but blockchain has actually made them fairly accessible to most people. So, for example, Manticore itself is a symbolic executor. and it does symbolic execution, which is a large range of techniques that basically explore state space of a program. They come up with some constraints. They do a whole bunch of path exploration and basically check the actual space of a program itself to see where a program would execute under which conditions. And then we have all sorts of other program analysis techniques, such as property testing, such as fuzzing, such as bounded model checking, those sorts of things. But basically, all of these are very fancy concepts for trying to understand what our program is doing, when and where, and under what conditions. So this might sound very complex. It might sound like there's a lot of things that has to go into these things. And if you're familiar with a lot of these techniques, it's very interesting because blockchain has another property of it. We roughly know when things will terminate. So many of the techniques that maybe would be untenable in traditional application security or in the traditional like application program analysis space are actually more tenable in blockchain because we basically know how much money we're willing to burn, right? And we'll get into what that actually means. But most of blockchain actually has some amount of money that you're willing to spend in order for an execution to go. And basically your execution terminates at that point. So if you are doing analysis, you basically can analyze your program under how much money you're willing to burn for your application or your smart contract to execute. So we know when things terminate. We know when we can, what sort of fixed conditions we'll have. And we actually end up with a system that is better for analysis than simple unit testing that we would get in more traditional InfoSec. So while I'll talk about many of these techniques, I'll allude to them. None of the things that we're actually doing are unique or different to blockchain. It's just that the environment itself is slightly more suited for this. So I think there's actually some good here. And I wanted to point this out because I know my rants can be negative at times and a little nihilistic. It's in the LEDET, it's in the subtitle. But I think blockchain has basically shown that it is possible to use formal methods, to use these advanced techniques, and you don't have to be working on the space shuttle. You don't have to be working on like on Mars rover or working on cars. You can use these techniques in a larger space, and I'll talk through some of how you can apply these techniques in other areas. But you absolutely are able to apply these techniques into new spaces and see, and see them actually go forward and gain analyses from them. And the other interesting thing here too is that blockchain is also uniquely willing to throw out bad things. We'll talk about some of the bad things that we see in Solidity specifically, but there are other languages and there are other platforms that we have in the blockchain space that are gaining popularity themselves simply because blockchain is perfectly willing under a variety of conditions to move to something new because it is just an easier space to do so. So I want you to think back, if you have heard of formal methods, when was the last time you actually heard it used? Now, I know some of the folks in blockchain space, some of the folks in InfoSec probably work for like defense contractors, or they work in aerospace engineering, that sort of thing. So you may have seen it there. But when we have clients come in, very often clients to Trail of Bits and some of our other security community members come to us with unit tests. They come to us with bespoke fuzzers. They come to us with symbolic execution traces. They come to us with property tests that they've already extracted. They come to us with invariants that they've already defined. And then they want an assessment. Now, obviously, not every client comes to us with all of these really cool things and everything all flushed out. But basically, we do have clients that are doing all of the hard work up front and making sure that these things are no longer exotic. There's no real need for abstract interpretation, for symbolic execution, for program specification or program analysis to be this exotic technique. And regular folks can actually work with them. And indeed, the community has actually produced quite a number of tools to work on them. So it's a very interesting space if you're a programming language theory nerd as well, such as myself, because all of these techniques, all of these interesting things that you've heard about are now actually completely accessible to you. And I thought we would look at two reports. And there's another area that this space is fairly interesting. Reports are very often public. So we actually have reports that you can go look at right now. These are our client reports, and they actually utilize some of these formal methods that we'll be talking about. So I wanted to look at the OX report. It's one of my favorite reports that I've seen someone write at Trail of Bits. It has a large number of invariants and properties that we've extracted from the report. It really reached in and tried to analyze what we were able to get out of these methods and how to fuzz things. And it's for a fairly complex system, right? This is not for a very simple smart contract. This is not for a system that basically just needs to put money in and take it out. It actually needs to handle calculations there, and that's normally when you're reading books or when you're trying these techniques on other applications. That's normally where they fail. And so OX is a fairly fascinating report. There's very interesting invariants extracted. And the same goes with Balancer. Balancer was interesting because it's one of the first times that I've seen symbolic execution used to prove that fixed point mathematics and dust collection, and dust is basically money. It's like very small amounts of money in blockchains, that they worked in the way that the system expected. So it's a fairly fascinating report as well. And my colleagues in our blockchain group did some very interesting work with these two. So what did we actually get out of this? Like, what was the actual win for us here? Well, I think the very interesting thing at first is we extracted these general properties that we expected to hold for the report. Now, obviously, as security testers, we're always doing this sort of thing, right? We're always thinking about, like, well, can an attacker steal assets? Can an attacker log in with someone else's credentials, etc.? That's less interesting. Where it becomes interesting is we're able to codify and model what we expect the system to do, and then ask these programs to generate automatic test cases that cause failures. So we'll get into some of these sorts of things, but we're basically asking a system to say, hey, search over the entire space of this program and find some way in which an attacker cannot steal, an attacker can steal assets from a public pool. Do that for me, because I can't figure it out myself. And so basically, by just modeling how the system should work, we're able to actually have the system tell us when there's a failure and then enter a finding against it. Now, that's really interesting, right? And the thing I wanted to point out is the actual complexity and nuance that a very simple property is able to get. Now, at Trail of Bits, we actually write our reports slightly different than maybe some of the reports that you've seen if you work in AppSec, or some of the other public reports that you've seen out there. But we include what's called an exploit scenario, which is basically a sort of story about how we got to this location or how this vulnerability occurred. But in this case, we're saying the exit fee has to be 0, your initial balance has to be this number, the initial supply pool has to be this enormous number, and then the attacker needs to call join pool and exit pool to burn this many tokens and pay one way of asset. And then the attacker receives all assets remaining in the system. Now, think about this. Where would you, as a normal assessor, come up with these numbers or these sorts of things? Absolutely, we all could do this. We could stare at the code long enough. We could model these things out ourselves. We could try to draw things out, draw out trees. But where formal methods come in, especially when you can leverage them, is that it will find these sorts of test cases for you without you actually having to dig in and find all of these conditions. You basically say, hey, I want this to hold. I want there always to be, an attacker is never able to drain a pool. And the system goes and says, actually, there is one way in which an attacker can do that. Now, this was via Echidna. It's a fuzzer. It's a property tester. But there are many different mechanisms by which you can do this. And these are the sorts of things that we're able to bring to bear in blockchain assessments that maybe other teams can start to use as well during their assessments. So I'm not trying to say that everything is rosy. We actually do have clients that have excellent models. They have all sorts of things that are pulled together, and then we still find blind spots. There's weaknesses in the model. They didn't necessarily consider some semantic edge case, whatever it was. But our clients still gain a ton of insight from this space. There's a lot of things that they can do now with formal methods that maybe they weren't able to previously. And what's even better is that there's a ton of innovation in this space going on right now. So there's quite a bit going on here at Trail of Bits, at consensus diligence, at runtime verification. They have this very interesting Firefly framework that I've been watching. But there's basically quite a few people working on these sorts of things to bring them to bear for normal folks to have access to the good stuff, to have access to formal methods. And what's even more fascinating, I'm stealing this from Dan, our CEO, we basically, you can run Slither, which is a static analyzer, has some abstract interpretation techniques, in seconds. And you can code something in Echidna and have it run and have results in hours. We're no longer talking about running a symbolic executor for 5 days or for 2 weeks in order to get a single break. We're talking about hours and days now in order to find, in order to apply these techniques and in order to have results come back for you. Now, there's also a related technique or class of techniques called semi-formal methods. And semi-formal methods may choose to have certain limitations in their model. They may choose to have certain limitations in their testing, or it may not be holistically applied, but it still provides quite a bit of security guarantees, depending on how widely you approach them. It still provides quite a bit of guarantees and helps you strengthen the overall posture of the program. The one that I am most interested in, just from I was impressed sort of vein, is what Tendermint does with invariants. So Tendermint is a blockchain framework. It allows you to basically build blockchains on top of Tendermint itself. And then they also have their own standalone blockchain on top of this called Cosmos. And a invariant is just some property that we wish to hold, either through execution of a loop, such as a loop invariant, or globally through a blockchain itself. So if you're thinking about these sort of things, it might be like, we never want someone to be able to withdraw more money than they've ever put into the blockchain. It's that sort of property. Now, in Tendermint, invariants are just functions. They basically are functions that receive some sort of context, that receive some sort of state, and you basically apply them and they return a closure, and then that closure can be used by the system in order to enforce that invariant. And there's all sorts of nuance to that. But at its core, we're literally looping over all of the accounts, and you can see it right here. I'm highlighting it. We're looping over all of the accounts. We're asking the account for its coins and checking that those coins are not negative. Now, if any of those are negative, we actually go through, add the address there, make a note of it, and then at the end we just say, hey, we've actually failed an invariant. There is an account with negative value there. It's fairly simple. So basically, all we really are doing at the heart of this invariant is making sure that every single account that we know about is actually positive in value there. Now, what do we as assessors get, right? Like, because obviously we're only in this for ourselves. What do we get for this, right? We now know when a client has invariants or they have other techniques in here, that there are a few good paths within the application. And we now know that those paths, maybe we check them for the robustness of that invariant, or we check them for other things. But we basically know that there's a good path there. Now, obviously, if there's a good path, the contrapositive to that is that there is likely a bad path. And we can start to focus on those paths that we see through the system that don't have an invariant applied to them. The other interesting thing, too, is that we have known good transaction states here in Tendermint itself, right? We basically know that if we get to this location, if we get past this location, that as far as the developer intended, this is a known good value. So now we no longer have that question like, oh, wait, should I be here? Is this wrong? Is this right? Etc. And we get basically much greater insight into tests because we're not sort of pinging the system one-off. We're actually running things through. And if the invariants are placed correctly, all of the transactions will pass through them. And then what's even better is that if we apply something like fuzzing or we apply something like property testing, we can find new areas for invariance, we can find areas that we can strengthen invariance, or we can find areas that we basically move invariance up the chain, duplicate invariance, those sorts of things. But basically, even with a semi-formal method in the way that Tendermint is using it, it's basically something that we can very quickly apply across our entire code base and sort of semi-rigorously shake out throughout our entire code base there in a very quick and automated fashion. Now, if you're paying attention and you looked at that code, you may think that's just an assert. And I agree, asserts are very close to invariance. There's some slight semantic differences between those two, but they basically can be used for the same purpose. What Tendermint has done is build up the machinery around logging, around system tracing, around context, contextualizing what the actual assert failure was. But at the heart of it, there's nothing really fancy about what we're doing. We're basically just throwing an assert into our code and making sure that some value holds wherever we end up and actually check that assert. Now, what does the client get? Now, there's some fairly interesting things here. If you look through and I'm not going to click through, but if you look through Tendermint's documentation, they actually list some of the ways in which their invariants are useful for their actual attack scenarios. So if you click through, you go through some of the locations that they've actually placed invariants, Tendermint actually uses these 4 attack scenarios, making sure that block and chain state are where you expect, making sure they're in central locations, and making them fairly convenient. So basically, there's this convenience function that they've now provided. And as security people, that's what we always want, right? We want our security not to be a hindrance, but to be a convenience thing, something you reach for and it just does its thing and people never think about it. Now, there's also the flip side of it. There are certain areas where, and this is a specific issue within Tendermint itself, there are certain areas where we've noticed an invariant is not as strong as we need. We notice that an invariant is maybe not as robust as we need. And then we have central locations that we can just look and fix that and say, oh, okay, we actually need to beef up this invariant, make sure we're checking how I believe this was with regard to multi-coin works. And that's literally all we need to do. So it's an assert, yes, and it provides you with some sort of state check and contextualization, but it also makes the security checks and the properties that you expect to hold throughout your entire system from one centralized location. So it's a fairly fascinating concept, even from something that is not as rigorously defined as formal methods. Now, I also wanted to talk about Vyper. I think Vyper is a fairly fascinating language. It's something that's coming out here, and it's really a response to Solidity. And if we get to it, I don't know if we'll get to it, but you can look through it later as well. If you look through later parts of this talk, you'll see that Solidity has some warts. It's not a great language. There's lots of very odd design choices. And the thing that I usually like to say to clients and folks who take classes from me is that Solidity is basically all of the problems of C combined with all of the problems of JavaScript with none of the good parts of either one of them. Now, in a normal environment, think if you worked at a bank, think about if you worked in some other like financial services firm, or you even worked in a startup, you would basically be stuck. So if one of your founders decided that they were going to use some blub language and it was basically it was terrible and horrible and you were so much smarter than they were, you basically are stuck with these sorts of things. But blockchain is very willing to basically experiment with a new language. And there's a few reasons for this. Basically, smart contracts cannot be updated. There's ways around that. But smart contracts aren't updated directly themselves. So basically what you end up with is a situation where once you've released software, you're now free to change things. You're now free to try things up. And Vyper actually brings to the table several improvements over Solidity itself. So there's quite a few math issues in Solidity. There's quite a few security issues within Solidity itself. And there's also some enforcement issues. And Vyper saw what folks were dealing with in Solidity itself and decided to try to fix some of those problems and provide them with a smaller language that's easier to understand and actually solves the problems that day-to-day developers need, which is something we in security talk about all the time. We would love for people to switch to new, more secure frameworks, new, more secure languages. But when would you be able to move an entire organization there? Well, blockchain is able to do this. Now, this is the one that I always like to talk about. What does U+1 actually do in Solidity, right? Now, if you're thinking about it and you're a little more familiar with Solidity, or you're familiar with probably some of the nonsense I was talking about with C, you probably are like, well, it's all nasal demons. I have no idea what it does. It's probably based on some crazy version of Solidity, and that's correct. Now, these are obviously very old examples that I used to use in classes, but these are some of my favorite language choices that have popped up in Solidity itself. So you basically have a uint, which is a 256-bit number, and you have some variable j, which is 2, and so you want to subtract those two. Now, in normal languages, you might wrap around. You might determine that the width is an integer here, right? We did not declare j to be a uint like I is. And so j might be an integer. You would upcast the entire calculation, and this would become maybe -1 or something there. Solidity actually determines that this is a uint 256 and gives you max -1. So you have this incredibly large number here. And if you're not thinking about this, if you're not paying, or Solidity used to, if you're not paying attention to these sorts of things, you end up in a situation where you basically very quickly can calculate something incredibly wrong. Another interesting one is this here. So Solidity used to do the narrowest type of integer. So 0 can fit in a uint 8, right? So j becomes basically a uint 8. We're checking, obviously j is then always greater than or equal to 0, or less than or equal to 255. And 255 is always less than dead beef. So therefore, we basically get loop exhaustion. And if you're not used to this language, or you're not used to these sorts of things, you obviously can code yourself into a corner very quickly with Solidity itself. So Vyper took all of these things, they listened to what developers were running into, and they decided to take the common remediation. If you've read some of these reports, you'll always see us say, you need to use safe math, you need to use pure modifier, you need to make sure you're not updating state. Depending on Solidity version, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Vyper took that feedback and packaged it into a smaller, safer language, and folks are actually using it. That's what's actually interesting. We have a new, smaller, safer language with built-in safe math, with built-in safety belts around the sorts of things that we care about, that people are actually using. And if you're familiar with Python, it's basically just Python. In fact, for a while there, if I recall correctly, Vyper just used the AST module from Python itself in order to read code because it was that close. And we've actually seen some very interesting projects here. We've seen folks who lift Solidity into Vyper, and then because Vyper is so close to Python, they just make some modifications, and now they have a Python model of the code that they're working on. So there's some very interesting things that you can do, but it's basically much closer and much safer than what you could maybe do in a traditional environment where you're basically stuck with whatever language choice you make when you first get into a project. The last good thing that I really wanted to praise is the community itself. The community is extremely, extremely open, and it's honestly quite ridiculous. We have clients who come and ask when reports will be published publicly. As you can see earlier in this talk, I listed right to our publications index. You can literally go there and look at some of the reports that we've done. And most of our competitors have the exact same system. They either have a GitHub repository, they have some website where they blog about their reports, but basically these reports are meant to go out into public. And because code is public and because these systems are dealing with money, the blockchain community has actually gone out there and really tried to make these things as transparent as possible. Now, there are problems with this, of course, but there is a sort of transparency that you could not see in the traditional InfoSec space, and I really don't think that competitors would work together as well as we do in the blockchain space here. So I also linked to some of our resources and some of Consensus's resources, because these are the sorts of things that folks leverage across the board, across the community. Now, was the positive side. I think we can talk about the negative side. We'll probably get through Solidity and YUL. We might get through test environment. I might skip forward to costs because that will be the more shocking side. But let's talk about some of the bad things here. So like I said earlier, Solidity is interesting. So integers range from 8 to 256 bits. There's actually some subtlety to that as well. It includes modifiers, which if you're used to other languages such as Python, you might have heard as decorators, or Java as annotations, or .NET as attributes, but they may or may not be applied. There's some obvious, they fixed some of these things. There are some interesting fixes for it. But basically, there are some really strange and surprising semantics. Oh, and by the way, there's inline assembly. So if there's anything that you remember from being a programmer in the early 90s, now you can do those sorts of things again. You can reach really deep into the machine and start to mess around with things because we brought back inline assembly as a regular use case. And not only that, but there's also lots of compiler bugs. So previously, the solc compiler used to use an exponentiation in order to list constants in code itself. So there were also some fun bugs with exponentiation itself because of some slightly poor choices that had been made during the development of it. There's also been lots of optimizer bugs. So you might test your code in one environment, then go to optimize it, and now you have a very different path through the code base because things had been optimized out. And because of the niche, many of the devs who work on solc don't necessarily need the same features as users do themselves. So we end up in a situation where the developers may be working on something that they don't necessarily use day to day, and then users end up reporting back bugs that are very different from maybe what the developers of solc were expecting to see there. So the result is that we basically end up in this environment where you have to be careful of what solc version you're using. You probably want to be wary of updating it. You probably want to be wary of optimizing. And I'm not saying never update solc, of course, but it's a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more gentle than maybe you would normally expect from just updating a compiler. And you also have to be aware of variable layout. And we'll get into this a little bit later. But you have to be aware of variable layout because of the way that Solidity and EVM works. And so basically, you end up having to test as much as possible at the actual bytecode level because Solidity itself and how it maps to EVM is actually quite complex. Okay, so that sounds bad, but it's actually probably worse than you expect. Solidity expects you to understand some of the layout of code. And we don't necessarily have to get into this. But basically, the way memory mapping works in EVM and in Solidity's application thereof, you basically end up with a area of memory used and contiguously laid out for all of the variables within your program. Now, they try to pad things, there's overruns, but basically if you're sitting here and looking at this and hearing storage layout and memory and those sorts of things and worried about that, you are correct. Solidity does have all sorts of overrun issues, compiler issues, etc., that you maybe would not expect from a high-level language that's meant for smart contract design. So, and if you are concerned about overrun, this is a bug from earlier this year, if I recall correctly. It's from April of this year, where basically there was a memory creation overrun, and you ended up in a very simple situation in which you could overrun the memory that Solidity itself was laying out for you, the developer. This is actually a fairly recent bug. I think it's just from October itself. But basically, in a few very simple steps, you can very easily corrupt the storage layout itself within Solidity, not even by doing anything complex. If you ignore this whole section with the inline assembly, via normal mechanisms, you're just basically laying out some memory. You have a struct. You're doing maybe some light typecasting, that sort of thing, but nothing too crazy. You can end up in a situation where Solidity's optimization and for memory has corrupted your storage. So basically, this is the source of it all. There's a length check that was basically incorrectly calculated for things that were less than 32 in value there. Now, these are all recent bugs. None of these things are like old versions or old flubs or those sorts of things. But basically, developers of Solidity have to be very painfully aware of some very low level details, and most of those are effectively untenable. Most of the time, what we see is developers sort of get something that seems very safe, and then they just continue with it because it's very hard to keep all of these details in line. Or we've seen quite a few developers go the other direction, where they program mostly in assembly. They know what all of their layouts are, and they basically just they basically go the opposite direction, away from any of the higher level features that you would see in Solidity itself. So what do we have as assessors, or what do we have as folks who have to use this? We have a low level language with difficult semantics, and those semantics require that our analyses actually understand the type width, understand the widening and narrowing techniques that Solidity itself uses. We actually have to trace and understand our memory model quite heavily, right? We have to understand how we do addressing, because Solidity does addressing based on some hashing and some other things that are in there, all with 256-bit integers. By the way, there's also quite a few parsing bugs. Solidity has fixed quite a number of those, including one recently where they changed the associativity of exponentiation operator with lots of edge cases, and in a compiler that is at best described as difficult. Now, this is not me knocking the Solidity devs. They're obviously working on quite a few things, but this is the environment that our developers see themselves in when they're working with this language. And now you can see why I'm happy that there's also so much innovation around things like Vyper, or folks working in the academic space around Obsidian, trying to fix these things for developers themselves. I actually want to skip to costs, because I think we'll get right to time with this. And if we don't, we can keep going into the ugly. But I think the costs are the other interesting area here. So by definition, blockchains actually literally run on money. Not all blockchains. I'm sure someone will point out that there are things like hyperledgers that don't require money. I probably have a text message right now from it. But basically, most blockchains run on money, literally. You pay some fee on top of electricity, on top of those sorts of things, and say, hey, I want you to run this transaction. I want you to run this application for me, and I'm giving you money to do so. So basically, in Ethereum, this sort of transaction cost is called gas, and it's measured in gigawei. And basically, you can think of 1 ETH as like 10 to the 18 wei. But basically, all transactions, all deployments, all function calls, all sends of money cost money in the system itself. You are never basically tinstaffel. There's no such thing as a free transaction on blockchains. Now, you did read that correct. You literally burn cash in order to run code on blockchains. You actually say, here is money that I am willing to spend in order to deploy. Now, there are transaction limits, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But basically, you say, I'm willing to spend up to this much money. I'm willing to burn up to this much money in order to run things here. And that's how blockchains work. Now, how much is this money? How much of this is actually, are we actually spending? Now, there's some interesting fees here. I went on Etherscan. Etherscan is basically like a central repository for Ethereum stuff. And I went to Gas Tracker, and I was like, give me the top 50 gas guzzlers. And I basically pulled the top 5, the top 5 things that spent money, right? And I think I only actually added up the top 4. But basically, in the last 24 hours, in order to work on, in order to run many of these large projects, folks have spent $558,000 in transaction fees, right? In the last 3 hours, we see Uniswap spending about $45,000 to run its fees. Now, it might seem obvious, like as you become successful, your costs go up. That makes sense. We all know that from traditional InfoSec space. But it's surprisingly quite a bit more money than you may expect itself. And furthermore, the more success you get, the more you actually end up spending. And on top of this, now you have a real value cost of unoptimized code. If the compiler outputs something that is, 3 instructions that could have been 1 instruction, that can literally cost you thousands of dollars, because now your transaction costs that much more in order to run on the blockchain, when in reality, if the optimizer had been working properly, that could have been optimized down, you could have saved money. And this is why you see people are so sensitive to the sorts of costs that come out of compilers and come out of those sorts of things. So this is the reality of operating in blockchain. Now, part of the other interesting thing here for us as security folks is that we talk to clients about correctness. We talk to clients about optimizations. Part of what we end up doing is talking about cost, because there's so many things that actually lead up to hidden costs, and many of the things that we in security that would like, such as extra validation, such as extra access control checks, those sorts of things, they actually cost clients literal money. They have to throw an additional dollar on the gas pile that they burn as they go through these sorts of things. So these things cost money. So now we are literally able to measure how much security can cost you or how much optimization can cost you, because you can actually start to estimate what your gas costs are within the blockchain itself. Let's talk through one more. I think I'm right at time here, but let's talk through this last area, which is time of check versus time of use. And I'm going to pretend I'm Gary Bernhardt. If you haven't seen his Destroy All Software What talk, I linked to it right here. But let's say enough about languages that suck. Let's talk through Solidity. So as if there aren't enough foot guns, Solidity is also reentrant. So basically, you can from very simple code accidentally give other programs control of your execution context. And there's quite a bit of nuance there. But basically, when we do certain very simple, very seemingly simple operations, we can actually accidentally give over control to another program. And that other program then can do all sorts of untoward things. So in this program here, the line that actually causes us problem, or the thing that actually causes us problem, is this very seemingly innocuous message.sender.call.value. And we're trying to return a value, trying to return a user balance, to the message sender. So basically, we say, hey, we're going to grab your user balance. We have it in a mapping. We have some extra information for you. And we're going to return that to you because you're requesting a withdrawal. And then we're going to set your balance equal to 0 after we're done, because you'll return execution context to us. Now, this gets extremely ugly, okay? What an attacker can do is they can call withdraw balance here. As you see, they have this launch attack function here, and they call withdraw balance. And withdraw balance actually, the launch attack actually ends up hitting withdraw balance. Then from withdraw balance, we call message.sender.call.value. And from there, we end up calling the attacker's code in this fallback function. And there's a few other steps in there, but effectively, the attacker now assumes control. So what does the attacker actually do? Their fallback function simply recalls withdraw balance right from within the fallback function itself. And this continues until an attacker has basically drained all funds itself. So we end up in a situation where now an attacker can go through, drain funds, in a very simple way, just from effectively 2 lines of code here. Now, where do we have to go? We end up in this situation where we use something like the checks effects interaction pattern, where we basically zero out the balance. We get the amount, zero out their balance, and then return that value to them. So no matter how many times the attacker attempts to call this, they'll basically get 0. They won't be able to drain anything else, or they won't be able to attempt to get more funds than they should be allowed. Or we can use other primitives. We can just use send itself. We can try to use transfer, and we basically end up in the same situation where the attacker is no longer able to just simply recall and recall each time. What actually ends up mostly happening, though, is someone doesn't understand their control flow. It's myriad. It goes through multiple places, etc. And you end up basically crying deeply because it's extremely common, and now it's just happened to you, and you have lost user funds, or you have lost something else there. And it's all because of the primitives of the language itself. So I think we're right at time. I can skip forward to the end here, but I did want to just say, does anyone have questions? Oh, there's 3 comments that were here as well. Yeah, perfect. Does anyone have questions, or is there anything that I can cover here before we hop off? Or Dula and Ben, is there anything else that you'd like to hear about?
Not from my end, no. The chat's been surprisingly quiet at the moment. I know you've been going through some very, very deep stuff, but
logical rants.
Hopefully everyone will go through and rewatch this again, because there's a lot of valuable information in there.
Yeah, I'll also post a link to the slides on Twitter, and we can also post it in this message here. I don't know, Ben, if you'd like me to just send it in chat, and then you can post it. But
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there is quite a bit here. It's also something very different than quite a few folks probably work in. But it is obviously a very interesting space to see. So I've just sent my slides to Ben, and Ben will probably put them in the stream. I'll also post them on Twitter there. But yeah, thank you very much for having me, Ben. Absolute pleasure. Also, too, obviously, if you're interested in more rants like this, I will be talking at Midwinter's Night Con as well. So perfect.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us again. I guess if there's nothing else, I hope you all have a wonderful night and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.